I signed the papers without a single word. No tears, no arguments, no final speech about everything he'd destroyed. Just my signature, steady and quiet, at the bottom of a page that ended 11 years of marriage. 3 days later, his entire world fell apart, and he never once suspected I was the reason why. My name is Emily. I married my husband, David, when I was 26 years old, full of the kind of certainty you only have before life teaches you otherwise. David was charming, ambitious, the kind of man who filled a room the moment he walked into it. I built my entire adult life around supporting his growing business, the one I helped him start at our kitchen table with nothing but a laptop and a shared dream. For 11 years, I was more than his wife. I was his bookkeeper, his silent business partner, the woman who reviewed every contract, managed every account, and quietly kept the entire operation running, while David took every ounce of credit at every industry dinner and press interview. I didn't mind, not really. Not until the day I discovered David had been transferring company funds into a private account for over a year, money meant for our joint retirement, money I had personally helped generate through years of unpaid labor disguised as wifely support. Money he was quietly funneling toward a life with someone else, a woman named Claire. Someone I later learned he'd been planning to leave me for the moment our finances were fully separated in his favor. I found the account by accident, buried in spreadsheets I still had access to. Spreadsheets David assumed I'd stopped checking years ago once his business outgrew my involvement, as he liked to say at dinner parties, always with that same dismissive little laugh. I didn't confront him the night I found it. I didn't scream, didn't demand answers, didn't give him the satisfaction of watching me fall apart the way he clearly expected I eventually would. Instead, I made an appointment with a lawyer the following morning, calm and composed. Carrying 11 years of financial records, I alone understood better than anyone else in that entire company. When David finally asked for a divorce 3 weeks later, arriving home with rehearsed, carefully practiced words about growing apart and needing space to find himself, I simply nodded, agreed without protest, and signed every document he placed in front of me without a single objection. He mistook my silence for defeat. He had no idea it was something else entirely. What he didn't know that day was that my quiet agreement wasn't surrender. It was the opening move of something he never saw coming. The weeks leading up to that signature were some of the most difficult of my life, even though David never once saw the effort it took to appear unaffected. I grieved privately, in the quiet hours after he'd left for the evening to see Claire, someone he still hadn't officially acknowledged, though I'd known about her for months by then. I grieved the 11 years I'd poured into a business that legally credited him as sole founder, despite the fact that half our early contracts still bore my handwriting in the margins. Half our biggest client relationships had been built through dinners I'd personally hosted and nurtured for years. I grieved, too, the version of myself who had once believed that quiet devotion would always be recognized, eventually, by someone who claimed to love me. But grief, I discovered, has a strange way of clarifying exactly what needs to happen next, if you allow it the space to do so. I spent those weeks doing something David never suspected, quietly documenting everything. Every unpaid hour I'd contributed to building his company, every original contract that listed both our names before he'd later altered incorporation documents to remove mine entirely, years before I fully understood the implications. Every dollar he'd funneled into that private account meant for the future we'd once planned to build together. I hired a lawyer who specialized not in dramatic courtroom battles, but in something far more effective, forensic financial investigation. Together, we built a case that had nothing to do with emotional appeals and everything to do with cold, undeniable facts that would matter far more in a settlement than any argument about loyalty or broken promises ever could. David, confident in his own narrative of a marriage that had simply run its course, never once considered that I understood his business finances better than his own accountant did. He never imagined that the woman who had quietly managed his books for a decade had been building a case just as carefully as she'd once built spreadsheets for his benefit. When he finally handed me those divorce papers, expecting tears, expecting resistance, expecting the version of me who had spent 11 years accommodating his ambition without complaint, I simply signed. Because I already knew what he didn't, those signatures were about to trigger consequences he had never once considered. But what I didn't know that final morning was just how quickly everything he'd built would begin to unravel once the ink had finally dried. 3 days after I signed those papers, David's business partner discovered the discrepancies my lawyer had already quietly flagged to the appropriate parties' discrepancies that had nothing to do with our divorce, and everything to do with the fact that David had been misusing company funds meant for shared business investments, funds that legally implicated far more than just our marriage. The private account David thought no one understood but him became the exact evidence that triggered an internal investigation, one that revealed financial mismanagement serious enough to threaten the entire company's standing with its primary investors. I hadn't reported anything vindictively. I had simply, calmly, ensured that the truth reached the people who were legally entitled to know it, the same truth David had assumed I was either too naive or too devastated to fully understand. His business partner called an emergency meeting. Investors began asking uncomfortable questions. Claire, I later learned, distanced herself the moment David's financial stability became publicly uncertain, revealing exactly how conditional her interest in him had always been. David called me that week, his voice unrecognizable, asking if I'd had anything to do with what was unfolding. I told him only the truth. I had simply stopped protecting a business built partially on my own unpaid labor. Once he'd decided that same labor no longer deserved acknowledgement or loyalty. The divorce settlement, once finalized months later, reflected 11 years of contributions no court could ignore once properly documented. I walked away with what I had genuinely helped build, not out of spite, but out of simple, overdue fairness. People sometimes ask if I regret staying silent the day I signed those papers, if I should have confronted David with everything I knew before he ever had the chance to serve me with divorce papers of his own. I tell them no, every time. Because silence, I learned, isn't always surrender. Sometimes it's simply the quiet space where the truth gathers enough strength to finally speak for itself. I didn't destroy David's world out of anger. I simply stopped shielding it from the consequences he had built for himself, brick by careless brick. And in the stillness that followed, I finally found the peace I had spent 11 years quietly waiting for.